Okay, think about that iconic interlocking C's logo for a second. You know the one. It's universally recognized, right? An absolute staple of luxury, elegance, and modern fashion that you'll spot on streets literally all over the world. But welcome to this explainer, because today we're unpacking an incredible, almost unbelievable inverted hero's journey behind that very logo. We are looking at a really jarring duality. On one hand, you have the spectacular rise of a visionary disruptor, a woman who single-handedly freed women from the suffocating physical constraints of 19th century clothing. But then, there is the deeply buried, heavily documented reality of her hidden life as an active Nazi spy during World War II. It's a completely staggering story of unparalleled cultural impact colliding head-on with deeply compromised personal actions. We are diving into a history that's going to challenge everything we think we know about one of the most famous figures of the 20th century. Let's get into it.
So, to really appreciate the disruption, you have to picture the heavy, restrictive Belle Epoque fashion that completely dominated the early 1900s. Women were burdened with these cumbersome, floor-sweeping outfits, excessive layers of heavy petticoats, and enormous hats that required constant, careful balancing. It was a rigidly defined silhouette that, honestly, severely restricted breathing and basic mobility. Now, contrast that world with this sleek, liberating, menswear-inspired silhouette that would eventually replace it. This transformation brought absolute simplicity, clean lines, and an unprecedented ease of movement. It wasn't just a style change, it was a complete paradigm shift in how women interacted with the physical world. Understanding exactly how society leaped from that heavy constraint to such modern minimalism is where our story actually begins.
Section 1. Before the Little Black Dress. Let's set the stage by looking at the rigidly structured, male-dominated world of Parisian haute couture at the turn of the 20th century. Look, fashion at the time was quite literally a cage. Haute couture was this ultra-exclusive club, regulated by rigid cultural norms and dictated almost entirely by elite insiders. The primary purpose of these intricate, highly decorated dresses, it actually wasn't comfort, mobility, or even personal expression. Not at all. It was to serve as a walking public spectacle to display a husband or family's wealth and social position. The physical toll on women was extreme. Tightly laced corsets were notorious for shifting internal organs and restricting the lungs so severely that women frequently fainted, which, by the way, is exactly why the Victorian era relied so heavily on the fainting couch. Women practically could not walk without assistance because their clothing compressed their chests and confined their strides. This was the deeply entrenched, literally suffocating status quo. Section 2, The Outsider's Rise. So the crucial point here is figuring out how Gabrielle Chanel, a woman with absolutely no traditional credentials, managed to completely upend this entrenched industry. Now, what's really interesting is how we can use sociology to understand this. There's this academic concept called forms of capital, originally developed by Pierre Bourdieu, which explains power dynamics within any given industry. The theory basically argues that to establish leadership or disrupt an established field, you need specific types of capital: economic wealth, social connections, cultural education, and symbolic prestige. Usually, the insiders hold all of these cards. They have the money, the elite network, the right upbringing, and the industry recognition. This immense concentration of resources makes it nearly impossible for a complete outsider to break through, let alone legitimize a radical new vision that actively threatens the incumbents. And the gap between the established power players and Chanel was just astronomical. On one side, you've got the Parisian incumbents, wealthy, highly educated, socially connected, power brokers, fully entrenched in high society. On the other side, you have Gabrielle Chanel's origins. She was raised in conditions of absolute extreme poverty. After her mother died, she spent 7 incredibly formative years in the austere, rigidly disciplined Aubazine orphanage. She entered society completely devoid of social, economic, or symbolic capital. She was, essentially, a provincial outcast. But interestingly, that time at the orphanage left a massive mark. The stark, monochrome habits of the nuns, which were utterly devoid of ornamentation, actually planted the secret seeds for a minimalist aesthetic that would eventually conquer the globe.
Actually, her complete outsider status provided her with a really unique, critical lens. While attending equestrian events with her wealthy lovers, she just watched these high society women struggling awkwardly in their encumbering, frilly outfits at the racetrack. And she realized something profound. The practical, comfortable menswear worn by the men around her, things like knit polo shirts, riding pants, simple neckties, could completely revolutionize women's movement. By borrowing clothes from her lover, Boy Capel, she famously created an elegance in reverse. She perversely took elements of lower-class or male attire, like just a plain white collar on a simple jersey dress, and elevated it to the absolute pinnacle of high fashion. She proved, for the first time, that true luxury could actually be found in freedom and comfort.
Section 3. The Ford of Fashion. Let's move forward and see how this subversive approach builds into her explosive mass-market success during the Jazz Age. So by 1926, the Roaring Twenties are in full swing. But Europe is still reeling from the devastating human losses of World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic. Because of this, mourning clothing was an incredibly ubiquitous sight. Chanel took black, a color strictly, and I mean strictly reserved for grieving widows and domestic servants, and completely transformed it into an elegant, everyday garment, the little black dress. She capitalized on an era of mass mourning and completely normalized black as a chic staple. Vogue magazine famously featured it on their cover and actually compared it to Henry Ford's Model T car. They dubbed it the Ford because of its brilliant, uniform simplicity, its universal appeal, and the explicit intention that it should be accessible to the widest possible market. It was a real game changer.
To truly grasp the sheer improbability of her triumph and how completely she had accumulated all that capital we talked about, we just need to look at the numbers. In 1931, her gross revenue reached a staggering 120 million francs. She employed 2,400 women across 26 different sewing ateliers. Think about that for a second. This former penniless charity case orphan, who started with absolutely nothing, had become the highest-grossing couturier in Paris. She amassed an enormous personal fortune, establishing a sheer economic dominance that cemented her as a global cultural titan. It was a rags-to-riches story for the ages, completely closing out her miraculous rise to the top.
Section 4. The Secret War. Now, we must execute a massive pivot to impartially examine the newly uncovered, heavily documented facts of her life during World War II. Drawing directly from journalist Hal Vaughn's deeply researched book, Sleeping with the Enemy, the historical record reveals a truly shocking timeline of activities during the Second World War. When the Nazis occupied Paris, Chanel didn't flee, and she certainly didn't join the resistance. Instead, she actually took up residence at the incredibly luxurious Hotel Ritz, living comfortably right alongside the German high command while the rest of Paris suffered under brutal occupation. During this time, she engaged in a romantic relationship with a Nazi intelligence officer, Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage, who went by the nickname Sputz. But you guys, it went far beyond romance. Heavily documented intelligence files reveal her active, formalized collaboration with the Nazi intelligence service, the Sicherheitsdienst.
Her involvement escalated into what honestly reads like a genuine espionage thriller. As an active German spy, she became a key figure in a 1943 mission called Operation Model Hut. Now, this was not passive compliance or just trying to survive. It was active intelligence work. Rogue senior SS officers recognized that the war was turning against Germany, and they needed a backdoor channel to the Allies. So they attempted to leverage Chanel's old, high society British ties, specifically her close personal friendship with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Chanel actually traveled to Madrid with the explicit goal of delivering a secret message to Churchill to broker a rogue, separate ceasefire on behalf of these SS officers. The documentation from this time also reveals a highly calculated financial maneuver. Factually speaking, Chanel weaponized contemporary Nazi Aryanization laws, which allowed for the legal seizure of Jewish-owned businesses, in an attempt to wrest total control of her highly lucrative perfume division away from her Jewish business partners, Pierre and Jacques Wertheimer. It was a direct maneuver to use a fascist regime's discriminatory laws to consolidate her own corporate empire. However, the Wertheimers actually anticipated this move. In a brilliant counter-strategy, they had temporarily turned the ownership of the business over to a Christian friend before fleeing the country. This legally outsmarted her and successfully prevented the seizure of the company.
Section 5. A Complicated Legacy. Finally, let's explore how she navigated the fallout of the war to cement her lasting image. Following the liberation of France, Chanel miraculously managed to largely evade serious consequences for her collaboration. Through cunning strategy and, frankly, significant financial payoffs, she effectively suppressed her dark espionage past. The most striking example of this involves General Walter Schellenberg, who had been her intelligence commander during Operation Model Hood. After the war, she actually paid for Schellenberg's extensive medical bills and even covered his funeral costs. By financially supporting his family, she ensured her name was kept completely out of his post-war memoirs. With this history successfully erased from the public eye, she seamlessly reintegrated into French society and orchestrated a massive, highly successful comeback in the 1950s, continuing her reign as an untouchable style icon.
So, what does this all mean? We're left with a jarring, unresolved duality. On one hand, we have a visionary outsider whose creative genius fundamentally modernized and liberated women's clothing. On the exact same hand, we have a deeply compromised individual whose personal actions included active collaboration with a horrific fascist regime. How does history balance the scale of unparalleled cultural impact against the immense weight of these hidden truths? I really want to leave you with this tension, and I encourage you to explore this complex history further, dive into the sources, and deeply consider, how do we separate, or can we even separate, the art from the architect? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.